What with it being Valentine's Day, happy Valentine's Day by the way, probably a few days late now, but I thought I'd do a vlog about love, and I wasn't going to talk about rom-com music or romantic themes. I was going to talk about a love that affects and afflicts our entire profession, whether you be a film composer, TV composer, a games composer. It is the scourge of us all, from journeymen like me, pawns in our game, to the very kings of our profession, at all stages in our career. And worst of all, it creates bastard children with poor genes. I am, of course, talking about temp love. What is temp love? Well, it's the love of temp. And what is temp? Temp stands for temporary music, which is added to a film throughout the kind of editing process to help get a feel for how it's going to sound with the score, to inform what the score should be like, to help it at test screenings, and for editors maybe just to kind of time their edits, get a kind of tempo feel for something. It helps basically a director and an editor kind of sign off the film. Traditionally, this was the domain of music editors. They had a specific job of editing music, all the way from the start of a film when they were putting temp in, all the way to the music score. Now, I watched Some Like It Hot the other day, which is, I imagine, 1950s. There was a music editor credited on that. So I think this is a kind of a dark art that goes back many years. It's a thankless task too, I may hasten to add. But I think kind of in the late 70s, early 80s, editors started getting good at editing music themselves. And these editors became the hero of the day, which is why this generation of editors look up to those as the kind of trailblazers. I also think that digital editing technology, offline editing, made it so much easier to do. You know, it used to be having to kind of put stuff together on a Steenbeck, which is a right old faff, but Avid and Final Cut and these digital editors just make it really, really simple. Now, that doesn't mean I object or dislike temp as a concept. In fact, really shit temp can be incredibly helpful. Okay, so you want a bit of music here, this is what you don't like about it, the orchestration is kind of correct here, but what isn't working about it is this, etc, etc. I've actually done scores that don't have a single measure of temp all the way through to lock, and whilst it's kind of it's a fun experience, I have to admit, you'll often find that things like establishing shots and stuff like that, they're not held long enough because the editor hasn't got a sense of the impact of the music. Now, it's not temp that's the problem, it's temp love, the love of a bit of music that's gone in as part of the temporary score that you just can't get rid of. You know, it's difficult enough getting our music onto films, but if you're first having to scrape the music off it, it becomes a nightmare. It makes us dance a crazy Lindy Hop, it fills our hard drives with rejected cues, it can get us hired, it can get us fired. It can also give us credit where credit isn't due. The thing we fear the most are 4 words connected with this kind of love, and it's not "will you marry me" or "I want a child," it's copy the fucking temp. And does the directing fraternity scorn upon temp love? I mean, look at Kubrick, Coppola, Ridley Scott, Malick. These guys, like, are the director's director. It's who every director wants to be. I was on the BAFTA jury the year that Kill Bill Volume 1, I think it was in the long list for nominees. Now, the score was credited to RZA, but when we queried the cue sheet, we found it difficult to find any cues that were written by him. So here's my top 10 temp howlers of music that I love but love to hate and directors love to love. Halapalapalapala by Sigur Rós. I don't know how you pronounce it, evidently, but we all know the track. It's as if Sigur Rós listened to the Universal by Blur and just went, this track would just be amazing if it didn't have the Cockney on it. So instead of like coming off a jog and feeling like a fishwife who's just won the lottery, you plug Sigur Rós into anything and you make the scene look like it's been filmed and directed by Jesus. So we've established that shit temp for us is good temp. I mean, usually it's quite easy to get rid of temp because, you know, it always lacks the dynamism that we can insert to shape the music to fit the scene. But there are a few examples, I think, of the types of temp that create the pesky temp love. Pricey temp is where you've been given 10 days to write a score and a budget to record it with 3 string players in Turkmenistan, and they question why there's a kind of a sonic difference between what you're doing and the temp which they've been using from the Da Vinci Code. Journey to the Line by Hans Zimmer from The Thin Red Line is simply put a orchestral, film compositional masterpiece. A gradually growing piece of music that doesn't seem to move, but just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over 6 minutes.
I've always wanted to ask Hans this. I wonder if he actually regrets writing it, because I know all of us as an industry are having to copy it time and time and time again. And I think there are a lot of films that Hans does where he's not asked to copy it, but he's asked to do the same thing. And what he did with The Thin Red Line was genius.
Now, resonant temp is where they put a piece of music on the edit which is already familiar to the end user or listener or viewer. This often will create an emotion, a resonance, based on the experience that the viewer has already had of this piece of music.
Clair de Lune by Debussy. I'm so staggered at how often this turns up, not only in temp, but you'll often hear it in films where they haven't been able to replace it. The reason you can't replace it is not even fucking Debussy could write something better than Clair de Lune. I had it stuck on the end of a French Holocaust movie, and the director said to me, I want something like that, but something that will touch the hearts of the average French person more. I mean...
Then there's unmidiable temp, when they stick a bit of like Prez Prago on and suddenly you're meant to kind of whip out the horns and the cajons and all of this kind of stuff. There's another one that drives me up the wall is when they put like massively avant-garde string music, which is why I said the LCO thing that we did was a game changer. It wasn't a game changer kind of in the sampling world, but just for us composers, it enabled us to kind of fight with that completely impossible midible temp that people occasionally will kind of spring on you.
Fratres or Fratres by Arvo Pärt, single-handedly one of the most extraordinary pieces of music written in the late 20th century, so much so, even Arvo Pärt himself has rewritten it about 20 times. Don't put it on, we can't replace it. It doesn't get better than this.
Paul, what's your temp nightmares?
Anything by Harry Gregson Williams, because it's impossible to pick apart what he's done. And also that amazing piece from Resident Evil by Charlie Clouser, which I think is called Convoy, which is just so cool and yet so simple. Again, impossible to reproduce.
The cue You're So Cool by Hans Zimmer in True Romance. This is not so much of a problem as it used to be. Certainly in the late 90s, early noughties, this was on every other advert. It was on so many temp scores. A very individual set of instruments. The minute you copy that spirit, it just passes straight off as plagiarism.
And I think we're all familiar with unicorn temp. That is the type of stuff where they take a piece of music that is just a one-off. It's got a weird selection of instruments or a very kind of definitive harmonic language or instrumentation or orchestration. And the minute you start adopting any of those elements, you're accused of plagiarism.
Any cue from Solaris by Cliff Martinez. This is just a fucking nightmare. And it's on everything. The number of films I've done where this has been temped. And I fear poor Cliff has had to deal with this as temp on subsequent films also. The problem is, if you take a steel drum and you play an ostinato on it quietly as a pedal, and you put some chords underneath it that move in the manner of maybe a Steve Reich piece, it basically is going to sound like Solaris. You can never get away from your music being passed over as Cliff's.
Meh temp. Now I think this is particularly difficult when you can't get them to...
Sorry, Christian.
It's all right. When you can't get something that is distinctly average off a temp score. I mean, I've even had drones that I can't get off because the one that I've replaced them with lacks the sense of irony of the original or the temp version.
Breathe Me by Sia. It's one of those majestically simple piano motifs that you could attribute to Coldplay, Radiohead, Adele. The problem with this track is it immediately, within half a bar, stimulates an affection in people. Oh, I really like this track. Who did this again? Difficult, nay impossible, to replicate the sensation of when you're presenting someone, the viewer, with a piece of music they've never heard before.
And then there's just better temp. There's stuff that you couldn't do better. It's like whenever I'm presented with the theme tune to Atonement. Dario did that the best way it could be done. I can't better it. Or indeed when an artist is cooler than you are. My beeps sound very similar to the beeps I'm trying to replace, but the beeps I'm trying to replace were made by someone from the Nine Inch Nails.
If your kindly editor puts anything from American Beauty, Thomas Newman, on the temp track, you are basically munted. This score sits in the perfect zone between quirky, impossible to recreate instrumentation, and familiar tracks that create and stimulate memories in people that they respond well to.
So what is the cure for temp love? Well, for me, with all afflictions, prevention is the greatest kind of solution. And the easiest form of prevention is to get on board first, get commissioned, and provide them with the temp. Not temp from, your past, but actual new material, a library, a suite, that kind of stuff from which they can edit. Make yourself available and really sell it to them.
Lux Eterna by Clint Mansell from Requiem for a Dream is possibly one of the most familiar pieces of music from the modern cinema canon. And it is fucking impossible to get off a temp.
The other technique was suggested by Daniel Pemberton in this roundtable discussion, linked below, whereby if you get a sense that some heinous piece of temp that you're never going to get rid of is being put into an edit, is to reach out directly to the editor and to kind of beg them, plead them not to put it on. Suggest something else, come up with something else, write something else, but just basically cut them off at the pass.
But by far, the number one temp nightmare we're all faced with is something that you've already written. Do you know what, Christian? I really prefer your original version of this. It's funny that, you can't better it because you wrote that, so why can't you just do that again? It's like, well, yeah, that piece that you liked of mine was the piece that was on the show reel that got me this gig with you. It's one of the best pieces of music I've ever written. I can write another piece of music that's maybe as good, but it's difficult to write the same piece of music that isn't the same piece of music that's better than the original piece of music that you've now heard 15 times.
My default way of dealing with pesky temp is to go super left. I think the best example of it is a film called Secret Moonacre, where they tempt the climax, a girl jumping off a cliff to her demise, with that Clint Mansell piece. And I thought, well, I can't compete with that. So what I'm going to do is just going to suck it back to a single solitary piano and a vocal, distant kind of female vocal voice. And what that gave my director was this kind of ownership over, instead of having, well, that was a dramatic moment, something that his peers could go, the way you handle that cliff jump was staggering. One of the best ways of fighting the kind of temp Lindy hop is just to bow down and go, listen guys, I can't do better than this. Use the temp. And you never know, you may get credited with it. Here's a funny story from my friend Drew.
So a lot of people ask me, how did the Prokofiev end up in The Apprentice? Actually, quite a lot of time people ask, did you write that? To which the answer is yes. So I was asked to write some music for the opening of the show, which I did, and that got rejected. So I wrote it again, and that piece got rejected. Then I wrote something else and that got rejected. And then I wrote something else and that got rejected. At which point it became apparent that really what they wanted was something that they already knew, which as a composer you'll understand is incredibly frustrating because nobody knows these pieces of music until they've heard them. So I left them to it and got on with writing The Boardroom or something else. Sometime later it became apparent that they were using the Pet Shop Boys' Let's Make Lots of Money. Perhaps a very fine song, almost impossible to think of anything less appropriate for the opening of The Apprentice other than perhaps Land of Make-Believe by Bucks Fizz. I was pretty despondent about this, but that was their choice. I'm not in a position as a composer to influence those choices. Fast forward some months, so one day I was in the edit for some reason, and they played me the opening sequence with the Pet Shop Boys on, and I just begged them to try something else. It was so wrong. I just happened to have, in fact the only thing I had on me was a CD, shows you how long ago that was, of the Prokofiev. So I gave it to them and I said, look, just to import the track, whichever one it was, track 15 or something, and just try it. And so we did. They imported it, they laid it back to the picture that they'd cut to the Pet Shop Boys, and amazingly and remarkably and unintuitively, it just worked to their edit that they'd edited to this completely different piece, the Pet Shop Boys. That was it, and it stuck. And just about everyone took credit for coming up with that idea. Just happened to be in my bag, could have been anything. Some years later I went to see the Bolshoi Ballet at the Opera House. Every time that bit of the piece, that march, comes in, which is quite a few times during the ballet, if you know it, everyone just started murmuring and tittering, and all I can say really is I'm just very sorry.
Indeed, you can check out the links below to that Khachaturian piece. Yes, James Horner didn't write that. And also the Corn Gold. John Williams kind of did, he kind of rewrote it. And this takes me back to my original point. It happens to the best of us. Sometimes you need to kind of pick your battles, roll over, show your soft underbelly, and copy the fucking temp. If you've got any temp love nightmares to share, or indeed you feel I've omitted some temp love classics, please share in the comments section below.